My guest's name is Dr. Robin Harfouche, and Robin, there was literally a tug of war over your life, your entire life, because one side of your family was Christian. Another side of your family was into witchcraft. And so there was a spiritual tug of war on you from the very beginning.
Yes, Sid. In my family, one half, like you said, was Christian. The other was my great-grandmother was into black witchcraft. And, from the time I was born, as a Christian would pray down in generations, that every generation would be a Christian. Also on the satanic side, they do the exact same thing. They proclaim, they declare, they fast, they pray that on their generations that there would be children born with what they call the veil, which basically would open you up from the time of really just being born into a whole realm of the spirit, which is not open to an ordinary person. And from the time I can even remember, I could read people's thoughts, and I could see things that other children, couldn't see, which separated me very quickly, from everyone else.
Just out of curiosity, what does you said you explained the veil, but is this something they can actually see on a baby when the baby's born?
Well, they can see the presence of that veil on a child,
But the thing that's very intriguing to me is that when you were about 18 years of age,
yes,
a spirit guide came to you by the name of Marilyn. Tell me about this guide.
I was in university, Sid, and I was walking to my journalism class. This is broad day, like right out broad daylight.
Right.
Other kids around me. And I heard this whistling sound behind me. And, and I turned to look, and no one else heard the sound but me. But I saw this being, this spirit being. And now I'd never seen anything like this before, but I saw this spirit being. I would say he was about 9 feet or taller, and he was all dressed in white, and he had like long white hair and bright blue eyes, and he was dressed like what looked like a robe, like maybe somebody from ancient times. And he just began to speak to me right out in the open. And I looked around, and nobody else was hearing him but me. And I say him because, it's like, it sounded to me like almost like, I can't explain, almost between a male and a female voice. It sounded like a hymn to start out with, and then it turned sweet, And so as he began to speak to me, and then later on became more female, became more of a female presence, it spoke to me and said that I had been chosen before I was born, and to be a prophet to the New Age movement, which at that time I was 18 years old. That was a while ago. And the term New Age wasn't even, out there. It wasn't even, it wasn't even a used term. People just didn't even use it.
So you didn't even know what it meant until he said it.
No, I didn't. What I knew was what the Spirit told me was that I was chosen, that I had been watched my entire life, and that it had been with me my entire life. And it told me of experiences that happened to me when I was a little girl, and that it had been there, and that the presence that I had felt, that it protected me, was this spirit guide, And
of course, you knew that everything this spirit guide was telling you was true. It had happened when you were younger.
Absolutely true, yes.
And did he tell you anything about the future beyond that you were being groomed to be a leader in the New Age?
Yes. He told me that that from that point on, that I was going to go into an intense training, and that I needed to accept this, this was my destiny, and that, there were people all over the world that were crying out for God, and they didn't have God, and that I was going to be used, as a mouthpiece. I didn't even really understand the term prophet, that, but I was going to be used as a mouthpiece, and the spirit guide led me to begin to study, and I went to the university library, and I picked out books, Edgar Cayce, The Clairvoyance, and started studying all of the channeling and the clairvoyant, and went very deep into that and studied it, and then went to the professors at the university where I was going who studied the paranormal, and I got involved with them, and they started putting me through paranormal tests, where they'd have a card in front of me, and they'd ask me what was on the other side of and I would describe the image, and so it was like all these gifts.
One of the things that happened, which was so amazing, Robin, is you received a phone call from a prominent Hollywood producer, director, and what did he say to you?
Well, I was actually staying at a girlfriend's house, and so, it wasn't my regular phone number, and the phone rang at her house, and he said, this is so-and-so, and I knew of his name. And he said, I'm just calling because I don't know how your name got at the top of my call list, because he was a Grammy winner and an Emmy Award-winning producer, director. And he said, but I really need to meet you, and so I went to his office and met him. And
what was it like?
Well, he looked at me and he said, I've seen people in the past. He goes, in this business, he said, we see something special sometimes on people, and we know that they're going to be superstars. And he said, I really believe that God has brought us together. And, of course, at this point, I am very involved in the spirituality of the New Age. I'm very educated, and beginning to channel and meditate, and so he was also involved in the New Age very heavily. And he said, I just see that star thing on you, and he said, you need to meet Shirley MacLaine's manager, and he said, now, he may only give you 5 minutes because, he was the VP of one of the largest theatrical agencies in the world. He said, but I'm going to make the appointment. Well, I get the call that night, and I have a morning appointment with this man. And I went in, and he's like this real powerful man, and I sat down, and he just stared at me, and he said, you have a spirit guide. And when he said it, my spirit guide appeared, and it appeared as Marilyn Monroe, just sitting on the couch in his office. And he said, and he could see the spirit guide, and he said, and your spirit guide is Marilyn Monroe, and I just started crying because, I felt like I was in meeting my destiny,
Mm. And this fellow was the manager of Marilyn Monroe?
Yes, he was her manager on the West Coast.
Who else did he manage?
He managed Dean Martin, who, I became very good friends with. Also Gene Kelly. And then Michael Jackson. At that time, we were working on doing a musical with Paramount. So he was handling that. He just handled them,
And Shirley MacLaine, of course.
Yes, Shirley MacLaine.
And the spirit guide, Marilyn, had been directing you and told you to become a dancer, which is highly unusual for an adult who had not studied as a little child to become a star dancer. But you did this, and you were able to be on a television show called Solid Gold. Tell me about that show.
When I auditioned for that show, most dancers start dancing when they're like 4 and 5 years old. When I auditioned for that show, there were probably between 700 and 900 dancers, and they only picked 8. And that, and that was my first contract. That got me my STAG card and got me in the business.
But Solid Gold was a major television hit.
Yes.
And you went on to do something like 40 national commercials, and but most people don't understand. I understand how supernatural it was. You should have never been able to be one of the dancers for Solid Gold on television with the background you had. And then all these prominent dancers probably applied, hundreds of them, and you won out.
Yes, but the wild thing was, everywhere, there's a very elite club. It's called the Actor Studio, and that's where Duvall and De Niro and Steve McQueen and pretty much everybody you could imagine who's like a phenomenal actor. They work and they work at this place called the Actor Studio. I auditioned for that, Sid, in my first couple years down in Hollywood, and I was immediately accepted, and it's a forever acceptance. And so you work directly with these guys, and it was just like that for me,
Well, his intent, this manager's intent,
yes,
was to make you a superstar. This spirit guide by the name of Marilyn, I would have to believe that this spirit guide was connected to the original Marilyn Monroe. What do you think? She looked just like her.
Yes, I believe it, but you can see Marilyn. You can see Marilyn Monroe's image. If you even look at some of the superstars now, if you look at Madonna, she went through that phase. You look a lot. I can tell on a lot of the actresses and pop stars that image will come on then, So I think that the spirit guide, is a very, very powerful spirit guide.
Okay, so you're headed to be on the superstar level, like the other people this guy's managing, Marilyn Monroe, Shirley MacLaine, Dean Martin, Michael Jackson. You're going to be at that level. You're headed on that road. The spirit guide is making sure that you will be on that level. This manager is making sure you'll be on that level. But the purpose is that you become a spokeswoman, like perhaps a Shirley MacLaine is, for the New Age religion. But your manager insists that you get into channeling where the spirit guide actually comes inside of you. Why was this objectionable to you?
Well, because it takes a lot of training, to allow that to happen, And when I went into my training, I went to one training session in Mill Valley, and there were 24 what they called psychics, and I was called a psychic, and I was in the group, and this woman came out who looked totally normal. She'd look like, she'd be your next door neighbor baking cookies, in the PTA. And she opened her mouth, and a male guttural voice came out. Mm. And, it freaked me out, because it was like things were revealed to me in levels. It's almost like, okay, you can handle this. That's cool. You know what I mean? That's fine. Then you can handle this, and then you can handle this, and then it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then the deeper you get, the more revealed that it is dark starts coming out.
Sure, you thought all along it was God, and you were doing something wonderful.
Yes, and I knew, that at that moment that it wasn't, and so I got very afraid after that.
I mean, you were so afraid, you told your manager you wanted nothing to do with a spirit guide living inside of you, and how did he react?
Well, the bottom line was he told me at that point, Johnny Carson was the night show, and he told me, look, he said, you're going up for a part next week. It's a co-starring role in this movie that Ron Howard was producing, and he said, when you go on Johnny Carson, you got to tell them, you got to talk about the New Age. You got to talk about what you believe in God, your spirituality. And I said, I can't do this because what had happened is that I gotten to the point where, Sid, I really couldn't control the entry of the spirit. Does that make sense?
That's pretty scary. In other words, at will, this spirit would enter you, whether you wanted it or not, is what you're saying.
Yes.
So you went to your manager and you said to your manager, Robin Harfouche, you wanted out, and what did he say?
He just said, "There's no way out." He said, he said, "This is the way it is. This is the deal. This goes right alongside with." All of, the acting and the dreams and all that, your aspirations and, because I loved dancing and acting and singing and I felt that was my destiny, plus, I wanted to tell people about God. And I told him, I said, this thing is not God. And he said, no, you're wrong. And I said, look, I'm losing myself and I don't have control over this, and I can't let this thing take me over. And Sid, I don't know why. I mean, after my life, and like you said, too much is much is forgiven. I had done so many things, and I just believe that the Holy Spirit and people praying for me, somehow I was smart enough to understand that if I made this final decision, which was what it was, it was a final decision. If I made this final decision, that I would no longer be myself, that I would just be a channel and I would just be owned, that I would be a product. And I didn't want that, I wanted truth. I didn't want that,
Okay, so you decide, I'm not crossing that line. I've gone too far. This isn't God. I want out. So you took a job as a waitress at Sonny Bono's restaurant, and all of a sudden you hear a voice directing you. What does this voice say?
Well, I'm so weird. I went up to a table, and there was a real famous guy there. I don't want to, slam him. I don't want to say his name, but he said something to me. He said, well, aren't you a dancer, and aren't you on Solid Gold? What are you doing here? And I got really embarrassed. I ran in the kitchen, and I didn't want to take their order. I'd only been there 7 days, Mm-hmm. And I heard my spirit guide say, what are you doing? You can't even face up to reality. But I actually felt like a hand pushed me. I ran from the kitchen out into where the bar area was, and I grabbed this drink tray away from this other waitress, and this 150-pound utility door stuck at the bottom and came down like a hammer and hit me in the back of the skull. And the next thing I know, I'm in Cedars-Sinai Hospital.
Is there any logical explanation as to, well, of course you were directed to go right to that door. At that time it was falling, but why did it even fall?
There was no logical explanation, Sid, and by the time I got out of the hospital months later, in a wheelchair, crippled, Sonny Bono had shut that restaurant down and moved it to Palm Springs. And so, I mean, basically it was like there was no way I could go in and, say this is, say anything.
Okay, so you ended up crippled in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
You saw some 23 doctors. It's not like you didn't try. What was the final conclusion of these 23 doctors?
Well, after months, I mean, my left side was paralyzed. My motor ability in my brain was damaged. I had to learn to speak again. I had to learn to walk again. Well, not walk again, but I had to learn to use my arms and my legs again. And I could walk if, they have those handrails. I could move my legs after about 3 months in rehab. But I couldn't get out of my wheelchair without, help. I had to go back in. I couldn't stay out of my wheelchair for longer than 20 minutes or I'd go into a seizure.
But would you get better?
No.
What did the doctors say?
The 23 doctors, they called me in, and my doctor, Dr. Silverman, he said, you're permanent and stationary. And he said, there's nothing more that we can do for you.
How old were you?
28.
So as far as you were concerned, your life was finished. As a matter of fact, the day you decide to commit suicide by overdosing on drugs, you get a phone call from an old friend.
Yeah.
Tell me about that phone call.
Well, I had put my phone on the machine, at that time we had phone machines. And I heard the voice of Prescott. He was a rock and roll bass player in a band. He was a Jewish guy who had gotten born again at the Presbyterian Church in Hollywood. And he called me and he said, Robin, he said, I just really feel like you need to go to church with me tonight. And, it was like something reached through the phone and grabbed a hold of my heart. And I didn't know. I had never heard the gospel. I'd never been in church. And so I just said yes. And I hung up, and took me 3 hours to get ready because I had to, go from my wheelchair to the chair to the shower and find something to wear. And, but the whole time I was getting ready, just like I knew I had to go. I didn't know why, and I just thought, well, I'll go. And then, afterwards I'll just come back and I'll take an overdose and I'll go to sleep, because I didn't believe that there was a hell. So he called me like about 5 o'clock that afternoon, and he said, look, I'm on the 405 freeway, and my car is broken down, and I can't come get you. Can you get somebody to take you? And I knew that there was no one, none of my friends, because I'd been about 6 months in the wheelchair at this time. None of my friends are going to take me to church, And so I got there supernaturally, and that's all in the film. It's a long story. But I got there supernaturally, and it was Hollywood Presbyterian. It was 3 blocks down the street from my apartment. I lived right up underneath the Hollywood sign. And I got to the church, and some guys saw me, and they grabbed me, and I had left my wheelchair in the parking lot at my apartment, and they helped me, and they carried me, into the church. And the power of God, the power of God, not the power of the spirit guide or the power of what I'd felt ever. And I, not just by feeling, but by revelation, this power came on me, and I was burning up like fire, and there was sweat pouring out of me everywhere, and I was sobbing from inside, way deep, and they sat me down, and my friend came in, and he said, are you all right? Because he'd never seen anything like what was happening to me, And they had the altar call, and all I knew was that Jesus is God, that everything I've been involved in was the devil. And I just wanted to get saved. I just wanted to know Jesus.
But then that spirit guide, Marilyn, shows up. What happened?
Well, all of a sudden, she's in front of me, and then it's like a veil is torn away, and I see what it really is. And it's this horrible demon.
But wait a second, she looked beautiful, like Marilyn Monroe.
Yes. But this was, that whole facade was ripped away, and it was a demon. And, it's like nobody has to tell me, the difference between Jesus and, the devil. It's so different, I was under the power of God, of Jesus, for 45 minutes. I don't really know what was going on around me, but I was crying from somewhere deep inside, and a really beautiful woman of God, an older woman, like a mom-type person, wrapped her arms around me, and, she said, "It's okay, baby. It's just Jesus. He's just healing you." And, they didn't know me. They didn't know my background, my situation. I mean, I think it was obvious that I needed salvation, and I was being delivered. But after 45 minutes, I managed to get up, and they sat me down on the front row, and I was out of pain. I was in pain 24 hours a day, Sid. When I left the hospital, my maintenance level medication was like 14 Percodan a day and 6 Valium, and then, sleeping medications, and there was so much medication. But I was completely and totally sober-minded, and I hadn't been sober-minded since the accident, months and months and months, 6 months before when I got hurt, and I was completely sober-minded. It was like all of a sudden the lights were on, like everything seemed bright. And, I tell people it's kind of like Disneyland, It's kind of coming out of the gray and black and white movies and going into the color movies, because everything was so brilliant. And then my whole body, my whole upper body was frozen. It didn't move, and my neck didn't move, and it all moved, and I was able to stand, and, it was incredible.
So you were carried into the building, crippled, confined to a wheelchair, except you could get out and walk just a tiny bit. But you were in pain 24/7. Did you walk out of that church pain-free?
Oh, yes. And the wildest thing about that was, no one knew me there, but the minister who was ministering along with Christian Harfouche, Christian came up to me and gave me a card, and he said, "Look, if you need any help," because they didn't know anything, they just knew that something supernatural had happened. "If you need any help, call this number, and we'll help you," And so that's how I got connected with Christian. I called that night because I needed help immediately.
And you wanted to help him, and you began using some of these New Age powers, and he immediately recognized what it was and prayed against it. But then at one point, he hugged you. And when he hugged you, what happened?
Well, the Lord really led him to come to my apartment with another young lady who was a very good Christian, and told him that I needed further deliverance. And he prophesied over me, like prophesied. Well, when he did, I had prophesied in the New Age, and so I prophesied back to him. Well, what I said then was completely directly from the devil, and so he just said, and he was very gentle, he said, "Robin, look," he goes, "you know now that everything that you were involved in, you thought was God. You really did. You know, you weren't a Satanist. You didn't sacrifice babies. You know, you really were looking for God, and you thought it was God. He said, but it was the devil. Now you know there's a heaven. Now you know there's a hell. And he said, now you know you're going to heaven. He said, but we have to shut these doors on these counterfeit gifts that you've been flowing in.
There was a moment where the Spirit of God just entered you and cleaned you out.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, you know, it was like an instant thing, you know, on the knowing the difference. But I still, from that point forward, I had to learn the Word of God, you know. And when I got baptized in the Holy Spirit and I spoke in other tongues, it was like the Bible became unlocked to me, you know, because as a new...
Well, just as there is a difference between the counterfeit and the authentic, I believe that most Christians are walking in a form of counterfeit. It may not be New Age, but they're walking in the natural realm when they could be walking in the supernatural.
And our whole ministry is the miraculous and the supernatural, and introducing people who know Jesus and people who don't know Jesus, to the supernatural, and, you know, helping them to understand that with a strong foundation in the Word of God, a real understanding in the Word of God, you know, about how Jesus, like you said, Jesus lives in us. You know, the Spirit guide coming in is the counterfeit, you know, of Christ wanting to fill us. And when Jesus lives in us, there's no room for any other ghost